All right, today we're going to pick up and talk about nucleic acids and proteins. Last time we talked about carbohydrates and lipids. So nucleic acids are made of these 5 elements mainly: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Carbohydrates and lipids were mainly just made out of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with the exception of phospholipids in the cell membrane, which did have phosphate, but really just CH and O. So nucleic acids are a little different. They're the first one we were talking about that actually contains nitrogen. So the building blocks of nucleic acids are called nucleotides, and each nucleotide has 3 parts. A 5-carbon sugar, and that's here. This happens to be deoxyribose. A phosphate group. Here's the phosphate group. One way to remember that, it's got a P, a phosphorus, in the middle. And then something called a nitrogen base. This is a nitrogen base right here. Again, you might recognize because it's actually got nitrogens in it. So those are the 3 parts of a nucleotide, which is, remember, just your monomer, your building block. Now these get put together into more complicated molecules, and we actually do an entire chapter next semester about DNA and RNA and their roles. So we're not going to get into it too much now, but their importance is that they store and transmit genetic information. And so this includes your DNA and also RNA and also something called ATP, which we're going to talk about in a couple of chapters as well, that has to do with energy in your mitochondria, your powerhouse. So these are the 3 parts of a nucleotide. The sugar, in this case, it's deoxyribose, which is where the D in DNA comes from. RNA has a different sugar called ribose. And this is our phosphate group, and then this is called a nitrogen base. And there's some different bases. DNA versus RNA, how are they different from each other? So DNA is a double helix. You've probably learned that before. So this is a picture of DNA. You can see how it's got 2 sides. And the nitrogen bases actually connect in the middle. You might have learned like A connects to T and G connects to C, but if you never learned that, that's okay. These are the 4 nitrogen bases in DNA. They differ from each other a little bit. They look very similar. But the little chains sticking off are a little bit different in each one. Plus these 2 have 2 rings, notice, 2 nitrogen carbon rings, and these 2 only have 1. Anyway, they're both important in making proteins. The DNA is sort of your blueprints, the directions, and then and it's considered your molecule of inheritance, mainly because it tells your cell what proteins to make, and your body is mostly made of proteins. We're about to talk about that in a minute. RNA, on the other hand, is single-stranded, if you notice here. It's only got 1 side. It also has one of the bases in RNA is different. It's called uracil, so instead of the base T, it has a base called U. But again, I get ahead of myself because we're going to talk a lot more about this second semester. All right, so proteins. This is our last macromolecule group. So proteins are made of building blocks called amino acids. So if you've ever heard of somebody like pumping up, taking amino acid supplements because they're trying to build muscle, well, that's the building block of all the proteins in your body. And what all amino acids have in common is they have what's called an amino group, something called a carboxylic acid group, a carbon in the middle. It's sometimes called the alpha carbon. This is the little Greek symbol for alpha. And then something called an R group. And there are 20 different R groups that exist. And I'll show you what this looks like in just a second. And the protein, every protein in your body folds into a very specific shape, and it's mainly based on these R groups, the 20 different things that can go there, because some of them like water, they're hydrophilic, some of them don't like water, some of them like each other ones don't like each other, and so the whole protein, it's a long chain of these amino acids, like it can be 100 to 1,000 of these amino acids long, and each amino acid will react with others in this long chain, and they'll fold into very specific shapes. Here's all the things that proteins do in your body. It's like 50% of the dry mass of your cell is protein. All the enzymes that speed up reactions in your body. Other than steroids, all your other hormones in your body, like insulin, for example. Structural proteins, collagen and keratin in your skin, hair, and nails. Elastin that makes your skin elastic. Transport pumps that carry things in and out of cells. Antibodies to fight infections, hemoglobin, which is in your blood that carries oxygen for you, also melanin that gives your skin its pigment. Proteins are super important. They're our main structure and functional macromolecule as far as keeping us alive. This is what an amino acid looks like. So this is the alpha carbon. Notice how it's in the middle. So it's called an alpha carbon. This is called a carboxyl group or a carboxylic acid group. This is called an amino group. And this is called, it's called an R group. It's sort of like how you use X in algebra to mean a variable. R means a variable. And there's 20 different things that can go in this spot. So these are some examples of real protein amino acids. See how this doesn't have the letter R. It actually has something there. So these are 2 different amino acids. This one's called alanine. This one's called serine. And like I said, there's 20 different ones. And there's a different thing in that spot. But notice this never changes. The amino group and the carboxyl group are on every amino acid. And when the amino acids hook together, they make what's called a peptide bond. And now you have 2 amino acids. But imagine that in a protein in your body, it's 100 or more of these all hooked together in a chain. So basically, this is what your proteins look like. You have a primary structure. This would be the chain of amino acids. Each little bead is 1 amino acid. They start to fold up into these repeating shapes. We're not going to get into too much detail on this. Then the whole thing folds up into a giant shape. And then sometimes these chains can also react with each other. Like hemoglobin that carries oxygen in your blood actually consists of 4 separate chains all bound together. So proteins have very complicated shapes in the end, and that's what allows them to do their jobs. So in summary, we've got carbohydrates. Their building blocks were monosaccharides, and they include sugars and starches. Then we've got lipids. Their building blocks were called fatty acids, and they include fats, oils, and steroids. We've got nucleic acids. Their building blocks were called nucleotides, and they include DNA and RNA. And then we've got proteins. Their building blocks are amino acids, and they include proteins, hormones, and enzymes. So that's sort of an overview of everything that we've talked about in this lecture. Now, the last little section here is about enzymes, because they are a very specific, special kind of protein. So chemical reactions in your body, if you remember, they rearrange molecules and atoms. Mass and energy are conserved, meaning that matter is not created or destroyed. And so, for example, carbon dioxide may react with water and form carbonic acid. This is a reaction of what happens, how basically you carry carbon dioxide to your lungs. So your cells make carbon dioxide, it reacts with water, and then it becomes this, and it's carried to your lungs where you get rid of it. But some reactions require energy. They're called endergonic reactions, and other reactions release energy. They're called exergonic reactions. And you have both of these happening in your body. You have reactions that need energy. That's the whole reason why you have to eat, to get energy for those reactions. But you also have reactions that release energy, which is kind of where your body heat comes from, is this release of energy. So photosynthesis, for example, is a process that requires energy, and it gets its energy from the sun. On the other hand, in your body, our cells do a process called cell respiration. We get the energy from the carbohydrates we eat for that process. So this is kind of a graph showing the difference between a reaction that needs energy and a reaction that releases energy. So this one on the right is an endergonic reaction. It requires energy. See how here's your reactants and here's your products, and you see how the products have more energy than the reactants do? So this is called an endergonic reaction. On the other hand, this is an exergonic reaction. So this is the reactants, this is the products, and energy is actually being released in this reaction. However, notice, even in this reaction that releases energy, there's like a little kickstart to get it going. It's sort of like if you were going to roll a ball down a hill. Imagine the ball is here. Now, if I can get it to the top, it'll go on its own, right? It'll just roll. You won't have to do anything. So overall, energy is going to be released. But this little kickstart, this has a name in our cells. This is called activation energy, and it's actually represented by the letter E with a little a, meaning the energy of activation. And this is the energy to get a reaction started. And it turns out that this is what prevents a lot of reactions in our body from just happening spontaneously. In other words, if it wasn't for this, we'd just spontaneously combust. Every reaction that releases energy would happen immediately. So there's this kind of controls and keeps us alive because we can control what reactions happen and what reactions don't. So how do you overcome this activation energy? Like, how do you make a reaction happen if it needs energy to get started? And the answer to that, you could use heat. Heat provides activation energy for reactions. Like in a laboratory, if we heat things up, we can make them react. So we don't want to just add heat to cells though, because if we do that, first of all, heat can damage our cells. And secondly, that would speed everything up. So we want to control reactions, right? So we want to just speed up certain reactions when we need them. And so what we do is we rely on what are called enzymes. Enzymes are special proteins. They're called organic catalysts because they contain carbon. They're made of protein. And what they do is they lower the activation energy so that a reaction can occur faster without it being hot. So if you look at the diagram here, you can see this is the normal reaction. And this is the reaction with an enzyme added. See how, so imagine instead of having to push the ball all the way up to here, imagine it's a lower hill. Ultimately, the amount of energy released is the same because they both start and end at the same spot. But we now have a way to kind of kickstart certain reactions. And this way, you can be very specific. I only want to speed up this one reaction and I want to leave all the other ones alone. I have a special enzyme. Its only job is to speed up this reaction. I need more glucose. This enzyme is going to break glycogen into glucose, but it's going to leave all the other things alone. And so this way we can control reactions in our body and make them actually 1,000,000 times faster than they would happen on their own. So, moving on. So a little more about enzymes. They usually are named with ACE at the end, like lipase, kinase, not all of them. There are enzymes that don't end in ACE, but that is one way you can recognize enzymes if you come across enzymes in your daily life. They end in ACE. They are very specific. Like I said, each enzyme has its own job. So you have hundreds of different enzymes in your body, and each one does its own job. And they can be turned on and off. We have special things that will, like changing the pH can activate or deactivate an enzyme, like in your stomach. The pH of your stomach, when it drops, that activates certain enzymes in your stomach. But when that food and the enzymes with it go to your small intestine, the pH changes and those enzymes get shut down. Also, temperature can affect them. High temperatures can also damage them and shut them down. That's why fevers are really bad. And we have special keys called coenzymes. Vitamins and minerals oftentimes are coenzymes that help our enzymes work. Here's what an enzyme would actually look like. They have a special site called an active site. That's right here. And the substrate, this is the reactant, it would fit in that site. And it would bind, and the enzyme would sort of help it, cause sort of like stress on the molecules, and help it break down. So on its own, could it break down? Yes, if I heated it up maybe to make it unstable. But by having the enzyme, it holds it just right so it can break more easily, and so the reaction happens a lot faster. This is called the enzyme. This is the active site. This is the substrate. This is called an enzyme-substrate complex when they're put together. And then at the end, the products are released, and really important, the enzymes are reusable. So you only need a small amount of enzyme, and it can be used over and over and over again. And that's important. It's not the same as like a match. If I use a match to speed up a reaction, once the match is burned, it's gone. But it's not that way with enzymes. They're actually reusable. Oh, and here's an actual example. This is sucrase, which breaks the disaccharide sucrose into glucose and fructose, the products. And so if you look here, here's the enzyme. It's empty. Here comes the substrate. This is the sucrose. Sucrose gets converted into fructose and glucose. And now the enzyme can go back and it can do it again. And so this is an enzyme that might be involved in the digestion of sugar. And that ends our chapter on biochemistry.